right, so I'd like to welcome our viewers and our listeners to a Phenomenology of the Phenomenon. This is a series where we discuss the application of the philosophical tradition of phenomenology to the study of unidentified anomalous phenomena and close encounters. The series is produced by the Society for UAP Studies, and I am the host, Kimberly Engels. And I'm very excited about my guest today. I'm here today with Matthew Roberts, who is the author of Initiated. Matthew, thank you so much for being here with me today.
Thank you, Kimberly. I appreciate it.
All right, so I'm very excited, as I said, about our conversation. So Matthew Roberts was a US Naval cryptologist for 16 years, and he was stationed on board the USS Theodore Roosevelt during the now infamous Gimbal event in 2015 with the famous Gimbal footage. He then transferred to the Office of Naval Intelligence in 2017, which was the birthplace of the UAP task force, where he began to have personal follow-on experiences with the phenomenon. He describes those follow-on experiences as symbolic, deeply psychological, and philosophical in nature. So with that intro and that bio in mind, I'm just very excited as myself, being a philosopher, hearing an experiencer go through something like this and emerge from the other side saying, hey, I think that this is something that's, philosophical in nature. It rings true to me, obviously. And so I'm really excited to dig into some of this. So first, as I start every episode, I like to introduce phenomenology for our viewers, especially if they're joining us for the first time, and for the guest as well. So phenomenology is a philosophical method that's rooted in the rigorous examination of first-person consciousness and first-person experience. Edmund Husserl was the founder of phenomenology. He advocated for a method of bracketing in which we suspend judgment on the source or origin of what is being interacted with and kind of take in everything as it appears. The phenomenological analysis involves describing exactly what appears to the individual, as well as how what appears is received, organized, and classified by the individual. So we have to be very careful about describing exactly how the object is presented to consciousness. Is it a perceptual object that comes through the senses, a remembered object, an imagined object, some type of psychic phenomena? While the scientific method is focused on collecting physical evidence that can be objectively verified in controlled conditions, the phenomenological method rigorously examines the experience of the witness. So what they saw, heard, sensed, felt, formed judgments about, as well as how they integrated that into their experience of self, other, and world. Now, I understand that's a bit long, but that's just an overview of the phenomenological tradition, both for you, Matthew, and for our viewers. And so I think a good place to start, if you're okay with it, is just telling us a little bit about kind of the event that started it all. Your experience on board the US Theodore Roosevelt that day that they filmed, what is now known as the Gimbal footage. Anything that you'd like to, describe to us about what appeared to you and what you experienced that day?
Yeah, so it was, we were finishing up our workup cycle off the east coast of Florida, and it was a normal workup cycle, except there were some odd things. I won't get into that, but so anyway, it was the end of our workup cycle. We were sitting back waiting for our grade, and a buddy of mine came into the skiff where I worked from his skiff, and he said, hey, check this out. And so I logged in, and I pulled up the files that he asked me to, and I watched, some of this footage, and it blew me away. I mean, I had kind of an emotional reaction to it, which was strange. And nobody else seemed to be having that reaction to it. And I became obsessed with this footage to the point that I was watching it over and over and over again. And we deployed after this, right? And so on deployment, I would, whenever I had a few minutes free, I would just quick pull it up on my computer and watch it again. And it got to the point that, some of the guys I was in charge of, came into the shop one day and they were headed into the back and they looked at my computer screen and they said, "Oh, are you watching that again?" And I was like, "Yeah, how do you not think this is the most incredible thing you've ever seen?" You know what I mean? Um, but I will say that, it's, I didn't understand why that was happening. I didn't understand why I was having emotional responses to this stuff until much later, obviously, after I transferred to the Office of Naval Intelligence. And I will say that, and I've said it before, and the pilots have said it too, that, when we were on station and deployed, they came back, right? So this wasn't just something right off the coast of Florida. It happened when we were on station in the Gulf as well. So there's that.
Wow. So can you tell me, you said it gave you an emotional response. Can you tell me more about that emotional response? Was it like awe? Was it overwhelm? Just a little bit more detail about the emotion itself.
Yeah, it was like it was just all of those kinds of intense emotions. I was feeling awe, but I was also feeling, honestly, a bit overwhelmed. I had this sinking gut feeling that was very powerful that they were there for me, and I felt kind of creeped out by that, but I also felt like, well, that's just nonsense, right? That's, well, who am I? You know what I mean? I'm just one of 5,000 people on this boat. And I'm not even that high ranking, you know what I mean? It's not like I was the skipper or something like that. So, it was bizarre. But there's also this, and this is like one of the many reasons why I decided to come forward with my story, was that it's almost like a gut punch, because you realize, oh my gosh, like all this stuff is true, you know um and then you start to think about, well, why isn't anyone talking about it? Like, why is this not why is the government, because it becomes fairly obvious when you realize it's true that the government has suppressed this, right? They've suppressed it, and kept it from people. And then it just starts to get very dark. The more you think about it, the more things just start to set in. Um, and the realizations are very dark there, you know.
So just stepping back, I mean, I completely I empathize with the idea of, this realization that these phenomena happen, that people see them, and that, it seems that the government knows more about it than they let on. Absolutely, that's a frustrating feeling. Going back to your experience, it sounds like, when you saw it, you were having the reaction and you weren't fully sure why you were having that reaction. Like
Yeah.
it wasn't just a reaction to obviously you saw the footage and you saw the way that object was moving, and it's not moving in the way that,
Right.
human made objects move. It's kind of, it's obviously, moving in atypical and what we'd say anomalous ways. And so that obviously, it seems like that, was part of your reaction, but your reaction actually seemed to be to something even like deeper than that. You seem to have like a felt sense. You said that it was specifically there for you, like that you were connected to it in some way. Am I getting that right? Or
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
I did have that sense, and it was very creepy, and I couldn't shake it, right? And I didn't know where that was coming from. I really kind of I don't know. I just don't even. It's almost like a car accident, right? Like you feel all this emotion, and you know that there's something going on there, and you can't take your eyes off it, but you want it to go away. I mean, I don't know how else to describe that. It's a very odd feeling.
No, what it sounds like, and I'll just engage us a little bit with Husserlian terms. It's kind of like your intention and the kind of the direction of your consciousness to this object, like it wasn't quite proportional, and you didn't know why. Like there was something about this object that was kind of overwhelming your conscious relationship with it.
Yeah.
And it was like more than you could kind of articulate and kind of puts any type of rational categories on almost.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
Okay.
and this, like I've said in other interviews, that this is not the first time, I've ever watched FLIR footage, right?
Okay.
I've seen this before. And so I could recognize that this object in the footage was doing things that just, it shouldn't be possible, right? And it didn't. I mean, it was almost like watching a cartoon, because the laws of physics just don't operate that way. Like, you
Right.
don't expect that.
Absolutely. Right. So it defies all of our expectations in terms of our understanding of how objects are supposed to move,
Hmm.
and how they how they the cause and effect relationships that we understand happen in the physical world. It
Hmm.
was not following those rules, basically.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Thank you so much. So this is already very interesting. So, I saw you on Encounters, the Netflix series, and you made a comment that I found very interesting as a philosopher. You said the physicists and the scientists aren't going to be able to solve this. You said it's a humanities issue. It's a social sciences. The psychology, philosophy. That's what's going to answer this. So can you just tell me, or our viewers, a little bit more? Can you dig in a bit more to that? Why you think that's the case?
Yeah, I mean, when I did transfer to ONI and I started to have these follow-on experiences, I right off the bat, they were just like dripping with kind of religious symbolism, right? And I recognized that immediately. And I thought, well, I'm not the first person who's experienced this, because some of the images and some of the imagery I was getting out of these experiences were things that I would see depicted in religious art from all over the world, right? Not just not just here locally, but everywhere. And so, there was that. And then it's interesting that you say when you talked about phenomenology earlier, you talked about kind of encapsulating it, and not not coming to any judgments right away, and kind of just letting it show you what it's doing, right? And so I very much took that stance throughout the entire experience, and I was an atheist, right? I did not believe in any of this stuff. I I didn't believe in the paranormal or anything like that. But as the experiences progressed, it became more and more difficult for me to deny um, the existence of all of that, right? And so, knowing that, it became clear to me that you're going to find the answers to this in religious studies and philosophy, and in the social sciences. I just knew that right away, because that was where I kind of started to gravitate towards, as my experiences wore on, right? I kind of knew that there was more going on here than I understood. And the symbolism and stuff that I was seeing kind of was steering me in the direction of the humanities and philosophy and religion. And so that's where I went with it. And in fact, post my experiences, I can read philosophy now, and philosophy of true philosophers, that is. And I can see my experiences kind of echoed in their writing, right? Like Plato's allegory of the cave and leaving the cave, and because you kind of adopt this new consciousness, this new awareness of everything. And I just describe that as the next. I think that there's anything crazy or odd about that, you know.
You cut out just for a second. So you said you described this as what?
Yeah, so I just describe it as like the next step in human evolution.
Okay.
And that there's nothing weird or woo about that. It's just what it is, you know.
So for you, it's not anything what we might say supernatural. It's just a progression of human consciousness.
Yeah, and I think people call it supernatural or paranormal, or they've got a lot of different words for it. But I think it's just an expanded awareness of what's really going on here.
Okay. Interesting. Very interesting. So I want to dive into these, you called them follow-on phenomena, and I know you detail them throughout your book. But this is something that I think within the public discourse is not fully understood about UAP or UFOs, whatever we want to call them, is that it's not just the sighting. It's not just the encounter. The experience of the witness often does not end there, right? And so you, in the aftermath of what you saw, the footage, and then you're rewatching it, but you detail a lot throughout the book that some very strange things started happening to you in the aftermath. So could we just start with, I know you talked a little bit about talking about some of the imagery, but if you could just be as precise as possible in terms of for the viewers, describing some of the things that started manifesting in your experience after the initial footage.
Yeah, so one experience in particular was the first non-human I saw in my room. And I can go into that experience. So I was laying there one night, sleeping, and then I woke up because somebody grabbed my arm, right, in my bedroom at night. And there's no one else. I'm the only one in the room, as far as I know. So I wake up, and I'm kind of looking to the left, and I'm looking at my window on the wall, and then it starts to go blurry, right? So I tried to lift my hands to my eyes to kind of wipe the sleep out of my eyes, and my hands just kind of flopped at my sides, and I thought, oh wow, I can't move,
So you felt that you were paralyzed in that moment?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Okay. I could not move at all. So I kind of fought to like turn my head to the right because I could still feel like a hand on my arm. And so as I do this, like my room is getting blurrier and blurrier, right? And so I'm turned to the right now. My head is turned to the right, and I can see that there's this like dark outline, a shadow of like a head, a torso, and two arms kind of standing over me. And I thought, I should be terrified because there's someone in my room right now, but I'm kind of not, which was odd. I mean, because you'd think that would be pretty startling. And so I'm looking at this, and then all of a sudden my room behind this shadow starts to light up with like golden light. right? And it gets really bright, and then it turns into like rays of golden light coming out of its head. And all of a sudden, like this face appears. It's almost like it had a screen in front of its face, like a high definition screen or something. And it starts flipping through, and I can see it's images of people that I know, right? And then it stops on an image of an ex of mine from like 20 years prior. Um, and I thought to myself, what is going on? This is bizarre, whatever this is. So I feel myself falling asleep. I fall asleep. I can feel like the bed kind of rustling. And then I fall asleep, and I'm having this like sexual dream, right, with me and my ex that was just shown to me. And then I wake up again from this dream, and I can see that there's this blue female, on top of me, right? Um, and my hands are on her thighs, and her skin is like, it's not like human skin. It was like thicker, and it felt smoother than normal human skin would feel. And I kind of tried to look up towards her face, and her face was blurred out. I could not see her face at all. But I could see that she was wearing like a tube top, and it had like these zigzag silver and red stripes on it. And so yeah, I was in and out of this dream state several times. And then I woke up in my room the next morning, you know, uh, and I felt just disgusting, right? Because I mean, people often will say, "Oh, how do you know you weren't dreaming the whole thing?" And when you're dreaming and when you're awake, right? You can tell the difference. Um, and so I knew I was not asleep. I knew I was waking up from this dream and seeing this blue female in my room. And my immediate thought was just that I felt disgusted, and I was just totally devastated by the whole thing, because I thought, I can't even tell anybody about this. It sounds crazy, right? Um, so I went down to my truck, and I'm like dry heaving, like I want to throw up, right? And I could not. There was like nothing in my stomach. But anyway, after being disgusted for a few hours and just feeling this repulsion and disgust, I thought to myself, that whole light show, it looks like religious art that I've seen all over the world, right? The whole golden light around the entity, and rays of light coming out of the head. It's like the painted halo on all kinds of religious art. And so I realized, I'm not the first person who's seen this. This has been going on for a very long time. And I thought, there is a lot more going on here than I currently understand. And so I need to kind of just reserve judgment and see what happens, so that's what I did.
Yeah, and that, as you said earlier, that really is a very phenomenological in your approach, because you saw something that had similarities with religious imagery, but you didn't jump to a conclusion like, oh, this is obviously like the Virgin Mary manifesting in my room or something like that. You
Right.
noticed that there was similarities in the appearance, but you kind of stepped back and suspended judgment about drawing a conclusion of exactly what that meant. A couple of things I just want to comment on. I mean, first of all, you talked about there was this entity in your room, and you had this very strong feeling that you should be afraid, but like you weren't. And I'm struck because that's something that experiencers like report quite often. I think Michael Masters has even he's calls it UFO apathy, meaning that, you know, the experiencer is seeing something that they should be like full-blown adrenaline, right? It's like your nervous system should be fully activated. You should be screaming, running away, and they're just like oddly calm throughout the experience. You know, in my interviews with experiencers and also reading the accounts of experiencers, you know, that's a theme that just comes up over and over again. It seems that something about whether it's the presence itself or the relationship to it, you know, it instills a sense of calmness that isn't completely, you know, rational or not what you would expect from that experience. And then I do remember you recalling this in your book, and I thought that, you know, I was very struck by, you know, what you were mentioning here about how you felt in the aftermath, because, you know, I remember in the passages of the book, you're just kind of like, it's sinking in with you. It's like, this happened and there's nothing you can do about it. You're like, you know, what am I going to do? Call the police? What are they going to do? You know, get in their spaceship and you know, arrest them, you know. And that is also something that, you know, experiencers report again and again. It's like, you have this profound experience that's, you know, sometimes it can be scary and traumatic, as you said. It's, first of all, it's defining our understanding of reality, but some of the experiences are you know, can be violating. You have that type of experience, and then in the aftermath, there's no one to even tell about it, right? There's no, because society just, you know, in terms of the dominance, I'll use Michael Zimmerman's language, you know, the social ontology, the societal agreements we have about the boundaries of what's real and what's not. You know, we have socially agreed that these kind of things are not real, that the person must be, you know, hallucinating, or as you said, you know, people assume that you must be dreaming. But, you know, going back to even Descartes, you know, at the end of his meditations, you know, he said, I can tell the difference between when I'm dreaming and when I'm awake. Like, when I'm dreaming, I think I'm dreaming, but I think I'm awake, but when I'm awake, I know it. And so it's kind of like we can differentiate, you know, the difference between, you know, a dream and waking consciousness. And experiencers often are able to do this. Sometimes they have an experience and they say, no, it was just a very vivid dream. Again, that doesn't mean it has no reality to it, but they experienced it as a very vivid dream. But other times, like you, they're confident that for certain aspects of it, they were awake. They were in waking consciousness and they recognized it as waking consciousness. And so when we're parsing apart these experiences and talking about, you know, the intentionalities and the relationship of conscious to the object, was it a physical object, or, you know, was it an object of perception? You know, as you've described it to me and as you describe it in the book, you could feel her, right? You said you felt her skin on top of you, and that was a sensory perception that you had coming in.
Right.
You know, and you formed that judgment, you know, that this wasn't a human because you felt it and you could feel like this isn't human skin. This is not what human skin feels like. You know, and you couldn't see her face, so you don't know, you know, what her face looked like. It seems like you were being blocked from being able to see that. But you were able to, you know, in that waking state of consciousness, be mindful of what you, you know, of the sensory input, the sensory object, and to formulate, you know, a judgment about it that I think seems justified. You know, that this wasn't behaving, or this wasn't appearing in the way that a human would appear. So first of all, I mean, so that one was very interesting. Are there any other, you know, of these follow-on experiences that you started having in the aftermath? I know you described some synchronicity events. Maybe, I think there were other figures in your room too. Anything else that you'd like to elaborate on?
Yeah, I mean, so I very much throughout this whole thing, I really did not understand what was happening to me, right? I just had no idea, right? But I was in the state of, I'm going to reserve judgment. But, you know, part of this what happens with these experiences is that, for me, I fell into this very deep depression, right? It was intense. And I got tired of it after a while. I was just I was exhausted. Because I wasn't sleeping, and I didn't understand what was happening. I didn't know what all this was for. And it was just dragging on and on, right? Months. And being tired of it, I just decided that I wasn't going to bother with this anymore. I'm not going to put any more energy into this. I'm going to forget about this whole thing. I'm going to throw away the books I've been reading, and just go on about my life. And these were just thoughts that I had to myself, right? I wasn't talking to anyone about this. So no one else would have known that I made that decision. But I did. And it was late at night, and I was like, I'll throw all these books in the trash in the morning, just forget about it. And I kind of just, I kind of said, just leave me alone. Just leave me alone. Just get out of here. And so I fell asleep that night, and I let it be known that I didn't want any more visitations. I was done. And of course, I woke up in the middle of the night that night. And I was once again had that paralyzed feeling that you have whenever they're around. And I open my eyes, and I'm looking across my nightstand, and I see coming into focus, there's this little man standing there, right? And the only way I can describe him is he looked like a yard gnome, right? But he had like a beard and long white hair, but he was wearing like these goggles, and it seemed to be some kind of technology, because there was light inside the goggle glass. I don't know what it was, no idea. But he telepathically is looking at me, and I'm thinking to myself, am I really seeing this guy, right? Because this is like the stuff of fairy tales right here. And so he tells me, kind of telepathic, his lips didn't move. He says, don't give up, keep going. And then I think I thought to him, go F yourself, because I was exhausted. And so I fell asleep. The next morning, though, I woke up and I thought, he must know something I don't know. I guess I have to keep going, and I thought, well, how can I keep going? I'm always anxious. I'm constantly living in fear that they're going to show up in my room again. And I thought, well, I just have to get rid of all of that. I just have to be okay with whatever is going to happen. And so from that day forward, I decided I'm not going to be afraid anymore, because I don't have any control over this. I'm not going to be anxious. It's going to be whatever it's going to be, and so I just let all that stuff go. And that was when everything changed. That was when absolutely everything changed. And that's why I call this like an initiatory experience, because there's this tearing down, and then on the other side of that, there's a building up, right? And so that was definitely the pattern that I experienced.
Yeah, I was going to say, it sounds like that was really the turning point in terms of kind of a letting go and opening up to the reality that this was happening,
Mm-hmm.
and that you were going to see where it led you.
Mm-hmm.
And that seemed to transform the relationship that you had with the phenomenon. And because the book actually, the last few chapters are very positive and optimistic. And it seems that you developed a much more amicable and transformative view of the phenomenon, but that breaking down came first, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I like the language of initiated or initiation, because it has, as you say, like parallels to the archetype of the shamanic initiation, right? It's like the shamanic initiation, before the shamans were granted, that special spiritual knowledge and the ability to kind of travel between the realms, they had to go through like a very terrifying experience, where they would feel themselves often, on the brink of death, being physically dismantled. They would meet beings that were terrifying, and sometimes feel themselves being dismembered and broken apart. So shamanic initiation was not a pleasant experience, but they came to like a turning point in the experience where they became open to what it was showing them, and then they were able to move forward, and they were granted or understood to at that point have these, what language you might use, like a new form of consciousness, or a new way of relating. So I'd like to talk, first of all, before we go there, you had these, you called them follow-on experiences. So one thing that happens in this discussion is, because many people like you, or many experiencers, have the initial encounter, and then they're never the same. All these things start happening in the aftermath. Why do you link? Because that's always the question that sometimes researchers pose. It's like, well, how do you know that these strange things that are going on in the aftermath have something to do with the original sighting or the original experience? So why did you connect the things that happened in the aftermath with what you saw in that initial encounter that day?
Well, so, when everything started for me, it was when this New York Times article hit, right? That the Pentagon had this program. We now know Luis Elizondo was the head of that. And so that was when I started looking into it and digging deeper, right? Because I had thought, well, this is some special program, some sap that I'm not read into, and so I'll just never know, right? But then when this article came out, I was like, oh, okay, now I have something I can dig into. So I started reading books. I read Tom DeLonge's stuff, and I read some Jacques Vallée, and a lot of the stuff that some of the things that Vallée talked about, people kind of, the way they describe these experiences are kind of dripping in religious symbolism, and I thought, well, that's a little kooky, you know. But then, when I noticed that about these experiences, I was like, oh, it really is that, you know. Um, the reason why I link it to that initial experience is because, it brings up kind of the same. I mean, I'm looking into UFOs at the time, right? And then all of a sudden, this non-human intelligence shows up in my room, and it's like, there must be some kind of, she must have taken some, it's probably parked in the backyard. At the time that was happening, that was a thought that came into my head in one of my waking states, that there must be some craft parked in the backyard, that she came in, you know. And so, that's kind of why I link the two, because I was reading Jacques Vallée, and this New York Times article had hit, and it brings up kind of those same, emotions all over again. And then all of a sudden, a non-human entity shows up in your room, and so it's not difficult to make that connection, if that makes sense. But then, there were things later on where, as these experiences were happening, for instance, I had left DC, and I went down to Norfolk, where I had some rental properties, and I was down there, at one of my houses. And I'm unpacking my stuff from my truck, and I look up at the sky and I see this football shaped like craft just above the horizon, moving along the top of the trees. And I didn't have my phone on me. I didn't have my phone on me. And it was I had already put it inside, and I knew that by the time I ran in and grabbed it and came back out, it would already be gone. But it was obvious to me that, okay, they followed me down here and they wanted me to know, you know. Um, so there were, obviously I did spot that craft. So linking the two isn't really that far-fetched, I don't think.
Well, it makes sense within, the content of your conscious experience and how this was all unfolding for you. And I think this is how phenomenology can be really helpful, because it's like, okay, from a Western scientific standpoint, we don't have any smoking gun of physical evidence that we can prove that there's, a cause and effect relationship here. But in terms of your relationship with these objects and with these experiences, it's all clearly connected. There's the way that it fits together in your experience, based on the things that you were thinking about, and then what then actually appears to you later, and then the physical craft kind of appearing right at that particular moment was a form of confirmation for you. It's like that's what you needed to see in that moment, to confirm that this was all interrelated.
Mm-hmm.
So when I first read your book, this was actually the first time that I was kind of tuned in. I guess I had read this previously in the work of John Mack, but it became, I think, more evident in your book. The changes in worldview, kind of the changes in ethics, the changes in values that you had in the aftermath. I mean, you talk about in the book how this eventually, led to changes in how you think about subjects as diverse as like romantic relationships, how you relate to people personally, how you even think about like economic systems, political systems, like all of that seems to have changed for you. So can you just, first of all, just walk me through a little bit, or just walk our viewers through, how did, or what kind of changes and conclusions did you eventually come to, and how did your experiences facilitate those changes?
Yeah, so I mean, in religion, they often talk about the eyes to see, right? And when all of this was over and there was this final ceremony, right, I started to feel a lot better. And then I started to feel better than I had ever felt in my entire life, right? It was like I had been carrying around 1,000 pounds, and that was gone now. Um, and I had no care in the world. And I describe in the book that if like a bomb could have gone off next to me and I wouldn't have even flinched, you know. And I was seeing something, right? I could see something now. And I didn't really understand, and I wanted to. I wanted to understand, what is it that I'm seeing? What can I see everywhere now? Because it became obvious to me that the message of and the experience that I had just gone through was everywhere, right? It's in the hero's journey. So it's in like every movie ever made, right? And I could see it in the Bible with the death and the resurrection of Christ, and I could see all of these patterns of this thing, and it was just obvious and everywhere. So I wanted to know, well, what am I seeing? What is this? Um, and it's very odd to describe this to people, but so I began to be taught, what it is that I'm actually seeing. And I was taught in a dream by a psychologist. His name was Dr. Robert Moore. And he wrote some books. One of the books he wrote was The Archetype of Initiation. And when I was reading that, I was like, oh my gosh, like that's what I just went through. You know what I mean? But I didn't know who this guy in my dream was until I was waking up one morning and I heard this female voice say a name over and over again. It was Robert Moore. Robert Moore. So I looked that up and I found him. Right. And then as I'm reading his books, his picture's on the back, and I was like, that's the guy from my dream. Right. But anyway, he talks about how basically you can touch the human subconscious if you're able to do it right psychologically. And so what I was seeing was the fact that everyone is projecting the human, rather than embodying that subconscious and becoming that, right? They chase it in the physical world. They chase symbols of it. And so that's why I was able to see these symbols in the hero's journey. That's why people love these things, right? But as someone who extroverts, right, you're constantly looking for the symbols in the physical world because that's what's real to you, right? As we were discussing earlier, that people have this idea of what is physical and what is real and what's not. You know, if it's non-physical and non-tangible, then it's not real. And so I could see this everywhere. I could see it in our justice system. I could see it in our politics. I could see it in forms of government. It was just incredible, right? And so that's why it changed my worldview and the way that I view these things, right? Because I had never had this perspective before, this kind of higher, more holistic perspective of everything. Um, so that was how it really changed my worldview, honestly.
It's really, really interesting because you said that this has, it's changed your understanding of kind of the categories of real and unreal, and that things don't have to manifest in physical reality in order to be real. And that seems to be one of the primary kind of messages or just like things that you've learned. Do you think there's something to it that the UAP manifests as physical objects? As, physical material, that's like the first thing that we see, and that's what makes it, an unidentified aerial phenomena is it, appears as a physical sensory object, but it somehow leads you to the conclusion that the physical isn't all that there is.
Right.
Does
Yeah.
does
Yeah,
that
and
seem meaningful to you? Or sorry, go ahead.
yeah, I think there is a point to that. There is a point to them showing up and in physical form, right? At least in the beginning of these experiences, and this is why people describe this as high strangeness, because they just don't understand it, right? But I think what's happening is we're all familiar with the story Alice in Wonderland, right? She sees this rabbit running past and it's got a pocket watch, right? And it's in a hurry. And so just like the UFO, and you're Alice, the question then becomes, will I or won't I try to figure out what this is? Right. And most people don't. They think it's beyond them. They can't. Right. But then others go down the rabbit hole, right? And they start to experience crazy things. And so Uh, and so that's kind of how I describe why they show up in physical form, to let us know that that's real and to kind of beckon us into this transformation that they put you through.
So I'm so interested in this that I did a human subjects study last summer with 15 individuals. So it was a small qualitative study, but people who had had encounters with some type of perceived non-human intelligence, and many of them also with a UAP. And, asked them very explicitly how this had changed their, well, if this had changed their worldview. And for all of them, the answer was yes. And then like more detail on how, asking them, how has it affected your view on consciousness? How has it affected your views on time? How has it changed your views on relationships? How has it changed your views on Earth and the environment? And even asking a little bit about politics, economics, education, criminal justice, and there were remarkable similarities in their answers. I think in terms of, all 15 said yes, it had changed their views on consciousness. It had made them, some of the themes were that, they no longer think that physical matter is all that there is, that, a lot of them were expressing some type of panpsychism or idealism, or just an understanding that they thought that kind of consciousness was the ultimate foundation of reality, or that at least consciousness is more interacts with physical matter in ways that we don't understand. Similarly, they express that they don't think time is linear anymore, that that time is more of a tool that we use to make sense of experience. It's not objective. And changes in, of course, the way that they relate to the earth, the way they relate to non-human animals, expressing that we need, an economic system that, doesn't treat people as, a means, but really, just something that's more fair and equitable, what was kind of the gist. So like these were constant, or pretty consistent, I'd say, pretty consistent themes. And obviously not everyone answered identically, but going through these profound shifts in worldview, I think seems to be a not universal, but common, in the aftermath of these experiences. So I mean, I have my own ideas about it, but why do you think that is? And this was even within a diversity of types of experiences and different types of entities. Some of them had abduction encounters, some of them had more, what you would call contact experiences that were more benevolent and they didn't, almost loving. But even across the wide varieties of the types of encounters that they had, they were expressing similar changes in their way of looking at the world.
Mm-hmm.
What do you make of that, or why do you think that so many people emerge from these experiences with those kind of changes?
Well, I mean, when you go through something as difficult as this, it's difficult for it not to change you fundamentally. Like I said, it gave me a new perspective on reality, period. Not just worldview, right? Because my worldview changed so kind of radically that I was, so here's an example. I was a liberal, right? Total liberal, right? And I just don't see things in terms of that anymore, right? I see things as either universally centrist or not right. Um, and so, January 6th, right? I woke up that morning. I knew it was going to be bad. I started to get emotional about it. And I started to get upset, right? Which I don't usually get upset. But I got angry. I was starting to get angry, actually. And I felt really tired. Despite having slept all night long, good sleep, I was suddenly overwhelmed and tired. I had to go lay back down. And so this is kind of a difficult thing to talk about too, because people don't often understand it. But so I went to sleep. I started having this dream, right? And I was told that, you know better than to get angry about this. This is nonsense what you're looking at. You are to only look at situations and see the objective reality only. That is all you can observe. And basically shame on you for going back to your old habits. And they told me that, we spared you this once by making you go to sleep through this whole thing, but that courtesy won't be extended again, as kind of a warning to me, right? Like, better, don't do this again. And so, I woke up that night. And I wake up that night, and my brother and his girlfriend are watching the news, and they're like, "You will not believe what you missed," and they were so worked up and so upset. And I just kind of had this blank look on my face, and they were like, "Well," and I said, "All is well with the world," and I went in and I sat down and I started reading my book, because that's the truth of it, right? We don't have to get emotional about these things. January 6th didn't have to happen because those people didn't have to get emotional about all that. But if they do, then they've got lessons to learn, and they're going to make that bed and they're going to lie in it. So it is what it is.
So, I'm just going to engage a little bit. Sartre has this concept of like existential rupture that he talks about, because he says, the individual kind of, they build their sense of self by kind of affirming certain possibilities over others. And they have this, he calls it a fundamental project. It's like this image of yourself, of who you are, and, what your values are, the kind of things you believe in, and who you want to be. And just kind of this conception of yourself. And he says it's kind of teleological, it's goal oriented. And so kind of all your behavior is directed, or your choices are kind of governed by that image of yourself that you have, this understanding of who you are and how you fit in and relate to the world. And you kind of make your choices accordingly.
Mm-hmm.
And he says sometimes you have experiences that just like rupture that fundamental project, rupture that image that you had of yourself that you used to organize your conscious experience, and kind of dissolves that pattern that you saw or that you used, to make decisions and understand who you are. And you kind of project yourself towards a whole new set of possibilities and a whole new, he uses the language like hierarchy of ends, like a whole new set of values and a whole new way of kind of organizing and understanding your experience in the aftermath. So is that kind of, do you think that language kind of captures, what happened? I mean, obviously it was very profound, this initiation, but is it kind of like you feel like the image of self and kind of the hierarchy of values that you had was just kind of like ruptured, and you kind of projected yourself towards a whole new kind of way of orienting yourself in relation to the world?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think that is, I mean, that's by design. My opinion of it is that you have to do that in order to connect with this thing that is greater than you. In order to touch the human subconscious, you have to do away with all of those things. The Buddhists have this idea of doing away with attachments. And so I think that that is absolutely necessary in the process if you are to formulate new values. There's a guy, the psychologist by the name of Dabrowski, who wrote a book called Personality Shaping. And his theory was called positive personality disintegration, where he talks about exactly this, where you kind of, these old ideas and these hierarchical values that you have are systematically shattered and broken down. And you have to then formulate new hierarchical values and rebuild yourself. um, and to think, and you have to think appropriately as well. And so, I that is definitely 100% a part of this process, and I preach that all the time. And I think your success or failure depends on your ability to do this positive personality disintegration and how well you can do that. I mean, there's a lot of people who talk about experiencers having, backgrounds that are very traumatic, right? Which means that they are more well adapted to facing trauma and then doing this disintegration where you take these values and you reevaluate things and you break things down. And I think, Dr. Eo Whiteley, I'm not sure if you're familiar with her. She's a psychologist, she's a pilot, she's an engineer, she's all of those things.
I've just recently met her, actually. It's kind of an interesting synchronicity that that you're
Yeah.
bringing her up.
She said on an interview that, a lot of people with this whole topic, this whole UFO topic, the reason why they have to deny its existence is because if you accept that as being true, then you start to realize that there are a lot of other things that you now have to go back and psychologically rebuild in your mind. And so people don't want to do that. They don't want to do that work. So it's much easier to just dismiss it out of hand. I'm not going to even look at the evidence because I don't even want to go down that road, right? I don't want to have to do this psychological work of rebuilding and tearing down old ideas, and it's because that's too difficult, right?
Yeah, this is so fascinating. I think these transformations that people go through, and John Mack even noted this in Abduction. He said, some of the patients, as he was working with them, he said, there was like kind of this moment of like pushing through, and this moment of, first of all, accepting the reality of their experiences. But once they had accepted the reality of them, they experienced kind of an ego death almost, or just like an expansion of self, or kind of a dissolving of the boundaries of the self. Because one of the things that phenomenologists really dig into is how we build up that conception of the me and the not me, and how we differentiate ourselves from other human beings, from the earth, from animals, from physical objects, and how we draw these lines between what we are and what everything else is, and kind of just the boundaries and the barriers of self, other, world, how we articulate those. And it seems that all of those boundaries in these types of experiences just get put into question, fundamentally. And each individual subject kind of reacts to it, in different ways, but seem to emerge on the other side of it with a similar, as you said, kind of a dissolution of the old self and those old boundaries, and a very new understanding of, a more flexible understanding of those barriers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that that's why these experiences are so strange, right? Because like I said, there's the tearing down, but you also have to have the building back up. So
Right.
you have to have the person forming an appropriate psychology And in order to do that, you have to show them certain things. Like you have to show them that there's no such thing as death, which is why dead people often show up, in these types of experiences. You have to show them that it's okay, that you can do away with fear, right? In our society today, we don't really teach that, and we don't preach it because we don't see that it's useful in any way. We always kind of think, oh, well, some level of fear is good for us, right? Because it keeps us from doing stupid things. But there's and so we need someone to show us, someone who knows what's beyond all of that, to show us know that you can actually do these things and take these steps to an extreme degree, that you wouldn't ordinarily take, except for in a situation, in kind of an initiatory situation, you know?
Yeah, Whitley Strieber and his wife Anne were one of the first, I think, to note that, in a lot of the letters that Whitley was receiving in the aftermath of communion, they were describing experiences of seeing, these potentially some type of alien or non-human intelligence, NHI. And alongside that, they were also seeing, deceased individuals, and how they didn't know, really what to make of that. But at least it was, a challenge to the traditional extraterrestrial hypothesis that this is just, somebody from a distant galaxy who flew over here and found us. If we're going to take the appearances seriously, the full phenomenology of what people are reporting, that's something we at least have to contend with, that, apparitions of the dead are common in these experiences. Sometimes, when Whitley originally wrote Communion, he left that part out because he thought the whole thing was already too wild. He don't want a dead person showing up too. But that was part of his original experience of that first abduction, is that, that night, someone that he knew, that he only found out later was actually deceased, was there. So absolutely, that's part of how this phenomenon appears. So the last topic, I wanted to talk about Jacques Vallée, but I think actually rather than talk, I was originally going to bring up his control system hypothesis, but you brought up all of this, religious imagery that you saw or that you recognize as having some type of religious connotation. And in The Invisible College, Jacques Vallée, he looks at some religious miracles, like the miracle at Fatima, and he really shows how the phenomenology of that experience is very similar to the phenomenology of UFO encounters or UAP experiences, because, it was perceived to be the Virgin Mary, but she was seen as, it was like the sun, it was like a disc that fell out of the sky, and it had very strange movements. It was not moving in a natural way. It kind of had like falling leaf type of movements in the ways that it was descending. And then it had a strange humming sound, which is also very commonly reported with UFOs or UAP. And then, it was raining out, and after the incident, underneath the disc, everything was dry, which they saw as part of the religious miracle. But that's also something that's been reported with UAP. It's like the there's an area that should be wet, or like sometimes a UAP lands and then, there's no water there for years afterwards. So there's a lot of ways that one could potentially interpret that. It's like, well, some could say, oh, well, that means that the UFOs are like sent by God or something like that, and just try to fit it into that religious framework. But I don't, first of all, I don't think that's the wisest thing. But why do you think, since so many of your experiences had images that you now recognize as images that have also shown up in what are understood to be religious experiences, what do you make of that? Why are so many people, why do so many phenomena that have been described as religious phenomena have similar appearance or phenomenology to UAP encounters?
Because I firmly believe that they're one and the same. And the reason why I say that is because just as I spoke to earlier, is that I could see that the experience that I had, the totality of the experience that I had, um, is what it's what forms the foundation of all the world's religions, living or dead. I could see that very clearly um, in reading the myths and kind of studying the religion. I remember at one point I sat down with my brother and his girlfriend, and we watched this documentary about Buddha and the enlightenment of Buddha. And I'm watching that and I'm like, man, that is exactly what happened to me, right? I mean, it was uncanny, right? And so, in looking that, and people think that all these religions are different, but if you realize that this experience that I kind of outlined and initiated, it forms the basis of all of those religions, you start to look at that religion in a very different light. um, you can actually see it when you start to really look at it, and then you can see that all the world's religions are in fact the same if you know what you're looking at. And that includes Christianity, as I said, like the death and the resurrection. I read the Bible completely different uh, than probably anyone else. So yeah, I think that, yeah, in fact, I opened the book with the myth that was central to the Eleusinian mysteries, right? Which was the kind of at the heart of the Greek religious experience, because I could see that that was exactly what had happened to me. Um, kind of metaphorically and symbolically. And so I do think that the two are exactly the same, and that the phenomenon is responsible for showing us that, because this is such a profound change. I mean, people kind of I'll have conversations with people, and I'll go really deep into some things, and they're like, wow, you're like some kind of philosopher or something. And I'm like, no, I feel like I'm just stating the obvious to me. I mean, it's not, um, I don't think it's really that deep, even sometimes. Because it's a lot of these deeper concepts, like the whole meaning behind the sexual experience. I often, I've tried to talk to people about that on podcasts. I don't really think they get it. But when I talk to other people who've been initiated, we can actually have a deep, meaningful conversation about that kind of thing, because they understand, right? And so, when I try to explain it to somebody who hasn't been through it, I'm just left with this kind of glazed over gaze, like they just have no idea what I'm talking about, you know? I don't know. Maybe I could do it different. I don't know. I really feel like I need to put this stuff and condense it into a language that people can digest, and we can use to teach each other about these things. Because often when I talk about this stuff, I like to talk about it in ways that people can actually see it in action in their own lives and out in the world out there. Because when you can see it, then it becomes more real on some level, even if you are kind of a materialist, right? You can kind of start to see this.
I mean, that was another thing that Whitley and Anne Strieber saw in the letters, is that many of them, they were writing in, there was some kind of sexual experience that was also involved. And I think you're correct that a lot of people don't know what to make of it at all, and just kind of want to honestly ignore it. Just like we don't even
Right.
want to talk about that. But again, looking at the full scope of what appears, this is part of the witness testimony. This is part of the experience or process, is that many times, at least some of the time, these experiences have some sexual dimension to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
When you say that, I just want to, for our viewers, we'll see if this characterizes it accurately. When you say, I said, why do you think that the phenomenology of something like the miracle at Fatima is similar to the phenomenology of UAP? And you say, because you think they're one and the same. Would it be safe to say that you think they're interacting with the same phenomenon, and then they are interpreting it through their own cultural or religious lens and kind of giving their own, again, at Fatima, it appeared to people from a Christian tradition, so they interpret it. It's the same phenomenon. They're just interpreting it through that particular, either religious or cultural or just that set of values. They're that's the framework of interpretation. And then others have an encounter with it. They're encountering the same phenomenon, you think, and they just might interpret it in a different way based on the cultural framework that they're bringing to the experience. Would that be accurate?
Oh yeah, I think absolutely. I mean, and this is the first time anybody's asked me this question, but it is very interesting, I think, because I feel like a lot of what I talk about is kind of intellectually beyond most people, I feel like. But I will say that you don't have to be that intellectually smart to go through this transformation. Because it wasn't necessary that I understood all of this in order to go through it. But in retrospect, I kind of do have an understanding and a perspective that allows me to see all of these different things that people think are all separate different things, but they're not. And so that being the case, I think someone who's not very well read, right? Maybe someone who's kind of unaware of mythology and other religions in the world would look at this and they would say, "Oh, Christianity, that's what I'm a Christian, and so this is what I'm seeing. It's something Christian, you know." And I think that people do that all the time. And I think that is why a lot of people aren't going to like this answer. but I think that is what is pushing, that is the force behind people who are still deeply religious and going to church, because they've experienced some of this on some level, right? Maybe not the whole thing, maybe not with the type of understanding that I did, because like I said, maybe they aren't as well read, or they aren't familiar with Joseph Campbell, they aren't familiar with myth, or any of those other things. And so they'll just automatically put it in that framework of, oh, this is Jesus, or oh, this is the Hindu goddess Kali, you know. And I think that that's what happens, and that's what perpetuates religions around the world, to be honest with you, is just that it's just kind of a lack of deep understanding about this stuff.
So just to rephrase for our viewers, they are coming into contact with something that is real, and they have to some extent encountered some aspect of the same phenomenon that you see yourself as interacting with. But they see it as confirmation of a previously held religious belief, rather than kind of being, as we said, perhaps stepping back and suspending judgment about exactly what the phenomenon is. Rather, it's interpreted as confirmation of a belief that they already hold, or a tradition that they're already kind of embedded in. And that kind of, I mean, it's understandable, right? Because then it doesn't pose a rupture to, as Sartre would say, to the fundamental project. The fundamental project can stay fairly intact. and that aspect of what they saw can just be adopted into the framework that they already have. And that's, to an extent, more comforting, because going through the existential rupture can be quite, it's a rupture, right, of self. It's very, very disturbing, and so that makes sense.
Yeah, and I'll add this too. So and I think a perfect example of this is if you ever meet anyone who's been in like addiction treatment, and maybe done some inpatient addiction treatment in like a facility, right? There's like a multi-step program to wellness, right? And the first step in that program is you got to stop lying to yourself, right? In other words, you have to realize you are the problem, right? It's not everyone else. And so when you stop lying to yourself, right, you start to deconstruct yourself. And it has the same effect. It has that same cascading effect of, oh, the phenomenon's real. So now there's all these other things that I now have to deconstruct and reconstruct in my psyche. And so you've got the same mechanisms happening there in addiction treatment. But you'll see people come out of the other end of addiction treatment, particularly here in the United States, and they'll start going to church, right? Because they've been through this transformation, but they put it into this Christian context because that's what they know. And that's what they're familiar with. And I think that's very interesting. I mean, and a perfect example of that is Robert Kennedy. I was listening to him give an interview the other day, and he was talking about his addiction treatment. And he says, "Oh, God helped me through it." And I knew exactly what he was talking about. And I've known other people that I've talked to about initiation in terms of addiction treatment. And it really is kind of one and the same, but it's difficult for people in addiction treatment to kind of see it from the perspective that I did at the time, because they're also going through withdrawal at the same time, right? And simultaneously they've stopped lying to themselves. So all of this stuff with positive personality disintegration, it's all happening at once, right? And so the lines become very blurred, and you can't see the totality of all of the different layers that have happened to you to get well. Does that make sense?
It does. Again, I find this all really fascinating, because it's all really about the path of the individual subject, and how they integrate and organize their different experiences, and how they formulate the judgments that they formulate, and why it makes sense to put something in a certain category based on the other aspects of self that they whatever space they're currently working with, whatever borders, whatever boundaries, and whatever system of values they have currently are using to make sense of experience and kind of organize their experience as a subject. Then that influences how they interpret certain things that appear within their experience, and how they kind of organize and integrate them into their sense of self. So it's very existential, and it's very phenomenological. And I think you're correct that it does affect how people interpret these experiences, and how they integrate them into their understanding of what Husserl called the life world, the world of appearances, and the world, the kind of the shared world that we all inhabit.
Yeah, and I will say too, Diana Pasulka does a lot of this work. She talks about this stuff, about how she'll go back to original sources and read it in like, I think, the original Latin or whatever language it is, and it usually isn't anything like the story that is told today.
Right.
It'll be completely different. And just like you were talking about the Fatima thing, where it was a disc in the sky, it wasn't an actual woman, with the traditional Virgin Mary dress on. You know what I mean? It was not like that at all.
Right, right. I mean, there was an apparition, but she, yeah, it was a disc that fell out of the sky, and a lot of it, Jacques Vallée has a chart in the Invisible College, and he goes through the phenomenology of that experience, and it's almost identical to the phenomenology of what people interpret as, spacecrafts. But again, it seems that they're interacting with the same thing, that they're just organizing and interpreting in a different way. Well, Matthew, this has been wonderful. I really enjoyed this conversation. Is there anything else, any lingering thoughts, or just anything else that you want to share with our viewers?
No, well, I think that I would encourage everyone to do what I did. I realize that that's asking a lot of people, and it might be, I don't know, maybe it's too much, but I feel like, if we were to have a society of people who understood nature themselves, that this place would be so much better, right? That it wouldn't be so messed up.
Sorry, you cut out. If we had a society where people what?
If we had a society where people understood the nature of reality for themselves,
Okay.
then I think things would be a lot better.
So when you say you encourage people to do what you did, you mean, can you just articulate specifically just the suspension of judgment and kind of the opening up to it, or?
Yeah, opening up to it, not being afraid. It takes a certain amount of bravery,
Okay.
right, to do this. And I at the beginning of all of this, I kind of meditated, right? After the New York Times article came out, I followed this like stupid meditation that I saw online that was all about, ask them for help or whatever and guidance. And so I did that. I was like, I want to know what's going on here, right? Like, what is going on? And that was kind of the beginning of everything, but I was very sincere about it, because I really did want to know. And it's difficult, but I really, I would encourage everyone to do this. You won't be sorry you do it.
If you're brave enough to go down the path of inquiry, it will be worth it.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. That's a wonderful note to end on. And I want to thank you, first of all, for sharing your story in Initiated. I really enjoyed it when I first read it. I thought it was very authentic, and you went through the different stages in your own thinking, and it influenced some of my thinking on the phenomenon early on, and kind of the questions that I wanted to explore. I saw that you had these changes, and I wanted to explore more of these transformations that people go through, because I think it's very interesting from a philosophical point of view. And I think that we have to take this aspect of it seriously, as you said, if we're going to get the full picture of what's going on. Like the empirical science will take us so far, but there's this other piece of the puzzle, or this other piece of the story, and that's the lived experiences that people have. And even Jacques Vallée said people aren't the same after these experiences. Something happens to them in the aftermath, and that's part of what this phenomenon is. So
yeah. And I also want to say thank you to you, because it's not often, especially at this stage of something that's very new, that you'll find people in academia that are willing to take this seriously and to take it on. So thank you to you for that.
And of course, I think it's very interesting, and I'm hoping, there's more and more folks in the academy getting interested, and hopefully more philosophers will start looking at this, because I really think that all working minds should be engaged with this, because it's really important, and it's really fascinating and really exciting too. So
Yeah.
all right, so thank you to our viewers once again. This is Phenomenology of the Phenomenon. I am your host, Kimberly Engels. Thank you once again to my guest. This is Matthew Roberts, and please join us again for further discussion of using the phenomenological method to discuss UAP and close encounters.